Commander Vex of the Galactic Federation's Assessment Division surveyed the candidates with 4 of his 6 eyes. The remaining pair focused on the datapad containing their profiles. 3 species were represented in this cycle's group: the crystalline, Lumerians, the gaseous Nebulans, and, most intriguingly, the humans. "Welcome to Survival Assessment Station Omega," Vex's translator projected. "You represent the best your respective planets have to offer. This evaluation will determine your species' classification and subsequent roles within the Federation." Candidates shifted nervously, except for the human, Mac. He stood with casual posture, examining the station's architecture with apparent interest rather than apprehension. "The assessment is straightforward," Vex continued. "You will be transported to Simulation Deck Terra 9, which replicates various survival scenarios. Your objective is to identify and avoid the highest number of dangers. Those who demonstrate superior hazard recognition will earn advantageous positions for their species." The Lumerian representative, Prism, chimed a series of crystalline notes that translated as eager understanding. The Nebulan, Wisp, pulsed in agreement. Mac simply nodded. "Interesting that you've named the simulation deck after our planet," Mac observed. Vex's upper eyes narrowed. "An astute observation. Terra 9 incorporates elements from multiple worlds, including what our records indicate as Class 12 hazard environments. Your Earth is considered a Class 13, what we term a death world. This gives you a potential advantage we've attempted to mitigate by including unfamiliar scenarios." "Class 13 seems extreme," Max said, scratching his chin. "Our planet has challenges, sure, but it's not exactly trying to kill us." Vex's mandibles clicked in what the translation system rendered as polite disbelief. The commander had reviewed the survival parameters of Earth. Extreme temperature variations, atmospheric oxygen encouraging combustion, microbiotic predators, tectonic instability, and radiation from a nearby star. Yet humans considered this normal. "The assessment begins in 1 rotation," Vex announced. "Rest well." After the candidates departed, Vex's assistant Trill approached. "Commander, I've been reviewing the humans' bioscan. Their neurochemistry is concerning." "Elaborate," Vex prompted. "Their threat recognition system appears fundamentally different from standard patterns. They register dangers but produce pleasure chemicals when approaching them. It's as though their evolution rewarded risk-taking rather than avoidance. I believe this represents a serious psychological aberration." Vex considered this. "Document your observations for the High Council. This assessment may prove more valuable than anticipated." Unbeknownst to them, Mac was at that moment exploring the station's corridors, mentally calculating distances, observing security measures, and locating environmental controls, all while whistling a cheerful tune. In his quarters, he reviewed the briefing materials one final time. Earth's Federation classification had always rankled humanity's diplomats. Death world status limited their colonization rights, and restricted certain technologies deemed too dangerous for species with inadequate risk assessment capabilities. Mac's mission was simple: prove those assumptions wrong. But as he drifted off to sleep, he wondered if perhaps the Federation's concerns weren't entirely misplaced. After all, he had volunteered for this mission specifically because he found the idea of a potentially lethal assessment interesting. Maybe humans really were wired differently when it came to danger. The simulation deck materialized around the candidates with photonic precision. What had been an empty chamber transformed into a lush alien landscape. Massive purple-leaved trees towered overhead, their branches swaying despite the absence of wind. A path of luminescent stones led forward into dense undergrowth. "Candidates," Vex's voice announced from hidden speakers. "This environment contains exactly 50 distinct hazards of varying lethality. Your task is to identify and avoid them while reaching the extraction point 7 kilometers ahead. You have 1 planetary rotation to complete this task." Prism immediately extended crystalline protrusions to analyze the air, soil, and surrounding plant life. The Lumerian's surface refracted light in complex patterns, their species' method of deep concentration. Wisp expanded their gaseous form to create a wider sensory field, tendrils of vapor testing the environment. Mac simply looked around, eyes narrowed in assessment. Then he did something that caused Vex to click his mandibles in surprise. He knelt and scooped up soil, rubbing it between his fingers and even raising it to his nose. In the observation room, Trill made frantic notes. The human is deliberately making contact with unknown substances. Continue observation, Vex replied, his scientific curiosity overriding concern. On the simulation deck, the candidates began their journey. Prism moved with exaggerated caution, stopping frequently to analyze the surroundings. Within the first kilometer, the Lumerian had correctly identified 12 hazards, including toxic spores, camouflaged predator plants, and unstable ground. WISP demonstrated excellent awareness, detecting subtle atmospheric changes that signaled danger. The gaseous entity had noted 15 hazards, including several invisible gas pockets that would have been lethal to solid life forms. Mac, however, puzzled the observers. He moved with greater speed than the others, yet had verbally identified only 3 hazards. His path seemed erratic. Sometimes he would detour widely around areas that contained no registered threats, while striding directly past others. The human's performance is suboptimal, Trill observed. Perhaps Deathworld species overestimate their hazard recognition capabilities. As they watched, Mac approached a stream. Both Prism and Wisp had stopped at the water's edge, conducting careful analysis before determining the safest crossing point. Mac, however, tossed a stone into the water, watched the ripples, then promptly jumped across at the widest point. Interesting, Vex murmured. He tested the water's reaction rather than its composition. The human's behavior became increasingly baffling as the assessment progressed. He appeared to be enjoying himself, even humming as he walked. When confronted with a grove of trees bearing spike-covered fruit, he didn't avoid the area as Prism had. Instead, he deliberately knocked one fruit down using a branch, examined its defensive mechanism, then proceeded to extract something from the center. Is he consuming part of an unknown organism? Trill's voice rose in alarm. Indeed, Vex confirmed. Yet his biosigns remained stable. As the first quarter of the course concluded, the statistics were puzzling. Prism had identified 18 hazards, Wisp 22, and Mac only 7. Yet the human had maintained the fastest pace and appeared the least fatigued. Perhaps, Vex mused, we are measuring the wrong variables with this one. By midday, the simulation landscape transformed into a vast grassland dotted with rocky outcroppings. Heat shimmers rose from the ground as 3 small suns blazed overhead, a deliberate recreation of a triple-star system known for its radiation challenges. In the observation chamber, Vex and his team monitored the candidates' progress with increasing fascination. The environmental shift has significantly altered their strategies, Trill noted, gesturing toward the main display. Prism had constructed a crystalline reflective shield, efficiently deflecting the harmful radiation. The Lumerian moved slowly, but methodically, having now identified 27 hazards total. Wisp had compressed their gaseous form to minimize exposure, creating a denser cloud that hugged the ground where radiation levels were lowest. Their hazard count had reached 31. Mac's approach, however, confounded the observers. The human had removed his outer garment, soaked it in water from his supply, and draped it over his head and shoulders. He maintained a steady pace despite the brutal conditions. The human's core temperature is rising to concerning levels, one technician reported. Yet he's not seeking shelter. His endocrine system is releasing stress chemicals, but simultaneously producing what appears to be enjoyment markers, another added with confusion. Vex leaned forward, all 6 eyes focused intently. Fascinating. He's deliberately enduring discomfort. As they watched, Mac approached a cluster of what appeared to be ordinary rocks. Both Prism and Wisp had identified these as hazards, camouflaged silicon-based organisms with defensive capabilities. But rather than circumventing the area, Mac deliberately selected a path through them. He's going to trigger their defense mechanism, Trill warned. Sure enough, as Mac passed, the rock creatures emitted high-frequency vibrations designed to shatter crystalline lifeforms and disperse gaseous ones. Yet the sound frequencies had minimal effect on human physiology beyond mild discomfort. He knew, Vex realized. Somehow he identified them not just as a hazard, but as a hazard specifically designed against the other competitors' biologies rather than his own. The assessment continued as the candidates reached the halfway point. A previously hidden monitor displayed their statistics. Prism, Lumerian. Hazards identified, 32. Hazards avoided. 32 progress rate. 43% wisp, Nebulan. Hazards identified. 36. Hazards avoided. 35 progress rate. 46% Mac, human. Hazards identified. 12 hazards avoided. 9 progress rate. 62%. This makes no logical sense, Trill protested. The human has identified fewer than a third of the dangers, yet has made the most progress. Vex's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. Perhaps we're witnessing something our assessment wasn't designed to measure. As the landscape changed again, shifting to a dense fungal forest with limited visibility, Mac's behavior became even more perplexing. He began gathering certain fungi, testing their flexibility and durability. Using fibers stripped from his clothing, he constructed a crude but effective filter mask. "Commander," Trill said quietly, "I believe the human isn't avoiding hazards. He's exploiting them." The observation room fell silent as the implications settled. The assessment had been designed to test danger recognition and avoidance, operating on the fundamental assumption that rational beings prioritized safety. But what if a species had evolved to approach danger differently? Mac's path through the fungal forest was neither the safest nor the most direct, but it was undeniably efficient. He seemed to calculate acceptable risk against potential advantage, in ways the assessment parameters hadn't anticipated. "Revise the monitoring algorithms," Vex ordered. "I want to know not just how many hazards he identifies, but how many he utilizes." As the simulation entered its third phase, the landscape transformed into a maze-like canyon system. Jagged rock formations towered overhead, casting long shadows across the terrain. Periodic tremors suggested tectonic instability, a deliberate challenge designed to test adaptability under pressure. In the observation room, the revised monitoring algorithm had produced startling results. "Commander, the data confirms your hypothesis," Trill reported. "The human has encountered 42 of the 50 hazards, but has only actively avoided 23. The remaining 19 he has either neutralized or repurposed." Vex studied the display with all 6 eyes. "Elaborate on repurposed." "He's using dangers as tools or advantages," Trill explained. "For example, he deliberately triggered those carnivorous vines to create a bridge across the ravine, and he's coating his skin with secretions from those toxic fungi. Analysis suggests it's providing protection against the biting insects in this sector." On the screen, they watched as Mac approached a series of geothermal vents, flagged in. The system is extreme hazards due to their unpredictable eruption patterns and caustic emissions. Both Prism and Wisp had detoured kilometers around this area, significantly delaying their progress. Mac studied the vents for several minutes, observing their eruption sequence. Then, astonishingly, he removed his water container, held it over a dormant vent, and waited. When the vent erupted with a controlled burst of steam, he sealed the container. "What is he doing?" one technician wondered. The answer came moments later when Mac encountered one of the simulation's apex predators, a creature specifically designed to hunt using thermal sensing. As the predator approached, Mac threw the container of superheated steam in the opposite direction. The predator immediately changed course, pursuing the false heat signature while Mac continued undisturbed. "Remarkable," Vex murmured. "He's not just surviving the environment, he's manipulating it." The monitoring station chimed as the system updated the candidate's statistics. Prism, Lumerian. Hazards identified, 41 hazards avoided, 41 hazards utilized. Progress rate, 67% Wisp, Nebulan. Hazards identified, 44 hazards. Avoided. 43 hazards. Utilized. 1 progress rate. 71% Mac, human. Hazards identified. 42 hazards. Avoided. 23 hazards utilized. 19 progress rate. 83%. The assessment parameters never accounted for hazard utilization, Trill noted with academic fascination. The entire evaluation system is based on the assumption that danger avoidance represents optimal survival strategy. "A logical assumption for most evolved species," Vex replied. "Survival instincts typically prioritize threat avoidance." "Not for Deathworlders, apparently," Trill observed. As they watched, the canyon system began experiencing more severe tremors, the simulation's difficulty automatically increasing to challenge the candidate's advanced progress. Rock slides threatened to block passages and crush the unwary. Prism formed a protective crystalline dome, weathering the danger through defensive adaptation. Wisp dispersed their form to flow through the falling debris unharmed. Mac, however, did something unexpected. He found a precarious rock formation and deliberately destabilized it, creating a controlled slide that cleared his path forward while simultaneously blocking a route behind him. The very route a pursuing predator had been taking. He's not just responding to the environment, Vex realized. He's reshaping it to his advantage. In the Federation's classification system, species were categorized partly by their relationship to environmental threats. Most evolved toward either avoidance or defense, but humans appeared to have developed a third approach: engagement. Alert the Council, Vex decided. The classification parameters for Deathworld species require significant revision. Night fell. On the simulation, plunging the landscape into darkness illuminated only by bioluminescent flora and distant star systems. The temperature dropped precipitously, another deliberate challenge for the candidates. Prism had entered a dormant conservation state, their crystalline structure absorbing ambient energy to maintain core functions until daylight returned. The Lumerian strategy was textbook survival. Minimize expenditure during adverse conditions. Wisp had located a pocket of thermal activity and circulated their gaseous form within it, efficiently preserving their molecular cohesion against the cold. Mac, however, had constructed a shelter using materials gathered throughout the day. Some toxic, some flammable, some reactive to specific wavelengths of light. Most notably, he had created a controlled fire using combustible spores from a fungus that both Prism and Wisp had identified as lethal. The human is utilizing exothermic chemical reactions from hazardous materials, Trill observed with a mixture of horror and admiration. He's basically surrounded himself with potential death and is using it to stay warm. Vex had summoned additional specialists to the observation room. Among them was Krell, the Federation's leading xenobiologist specializing in Deathworld species. This behavior is consistent with what we've observed in other Earth organisms, Krell explained. Their planet's extreme conditions necessitated innovative survival approaches. Their evolutionary path rewarded not just those who avoided danger, but those who could exploit it. Surely that's maladaptive in the long term, one technician argued. Species that consistently engage with threats must experience higher mortality. Individual mortality, yes, Krell agreed. But their species demonstrates remarkable collective advancement through this approach. They call it scientific progress. One human risks death to discover a principle, then shares that knowledge with others who build upon it without requiring the same risk. On the display, Mac was consuming nutrients while maintaining his fire. His vital signs showed he was experiencing mild hypothermia, yet his stress hormones remained lower than expected. More puzzlingly, his brain was producing chemicals associated with satisfaction. He's enjoying this, Vex realized. Not despite the hardship, but because of it. Precisely, Krell confirmed. Humans evolved a neurochemical reward system that incentivizes overcoming challenges rather than avoiding them. They seek danger not from irrationality, but because their biology rewards risk-taking followed by successful adaptation. As the night progressed, the simulation introduced nocturnal predators, silent hunters designed to test the candidate's alertness during recovery periods. Prism and Wisp, both in energy conservation modes, had positioned themselves in naturally defensive locations. Mac, however, had created an early warning system using resonant fungi caps arranged in a perimeter around his camp. When disturbed, they emitted a distinctive sound. The human slept in short intervals, waking regularly to maintain his fire and check his surroundings. His approach consumes significantly more energy, Trill noted, but provides greater adaptability, Vex countered. The others are vulnerable to unexpected threat variations. He maintains response capability. The night cycle reached its midpoint, and the monitoring system updated the candidate's statistics. Prism, Lumerian, total hazards encountered, 44 progress rate, 67%, unchanged during rest cycle. Estimated completion time, 7.2 remaining hours. Wisp, Nebulan, total hazards encountered, 46 progress rate, 71%, unchanged during rest cycle. Estimated completion time, 6.8 remaining hours. Mac, human, total hazards encountered, 47 progress rate, 89%, increased 6% during rest cycle. Estimated completion time, 2.4 remaining hours. He advanced during the rest period, Trill exclaimed. Vex replayed the monitoring footage. While supposedly resting, Mac had made several short excursions, mapping the terrain ahead and repositioning dangerous elements to clear his planned route. The Council will need to completely re-evaluate the Death Worlder classification system, Vex decided. Our fundamental assumptions about survival optimization appear inadequate when applied to species evolved under Earth-like conditions. As dawn approached on the simulation deck, it became increasingly evident that the assessment's premise, that danger recognition and avoidance represented optimal survival strategy, failed to account for species that had evolved to thrive by engaging with, rather than avoiding, environmental threats. Dawn broke over the simulation landscape, revealing the final sector, a wetland ecosystem interspersed with quicksand pits, poisonous vegetation, and camouflaged predators. Swirling mists limited visibility, while atmospheric sensors detected airborne toxins and parasitic microorganisms. In the observation room, conversation had shifted from scientific curiosity to serious policy implications. The Council representatives have arrived, Trill announced quietly to Vex. They're reviewing the preliminary assessment data. 3 senior Council members, representing the Federation's executive, scientific, and security branches, had assembled in an adjoining chamber. Their presence underscored the unexpected significance of this routine assessment. On the monitoring screens, the candidates had resumed their journey toward the extraction point. Prism moved with increased caution through the challenging terrain, their crystalline surfaces constantly adjusting to analyze environmental threats. The Lumerian had now identified 48 of the 50 programmed hazards, an impressive achievement. WISP demonstrated similar proficiency, their gaseous tendrils constantly sampling the air and soil. The Nebulan had detected 49 hazards, missing only one well-concealed threat. Mac, however, continued to confound expectations. He appeared to be deliberately exposing himself to certain dangers, while meticulously avoiding others, following a logic that the assessment algorithm struggled to categorize. "What's he doing now?" asked Counselor Zinn of the security branch, mandibles clicking with concern. They watched as Mac harvested secretions from a poisonous plant, carefully applying the substance to his skin and clothing. "Camouflage," Vex explained. "That particular toxin masks his biological signature from the apex predators in this sector. But it's also caustic to mammalian epidermis," Trill added. "He's accepting minor cellular damage to gain tactical advantage." "Unacceptable risk assessment," Counselor Zinn declared. "This confirms our concerns about Deathworld species. They prioritize short-term advantage over long-term safety." "With respect, Counselor," Krell the xenobiologist interjected, "I believe we're witnessing something more nuanced. The human isn't ignoring risks. He's calculating acceptable damage thresholds against potential benefits. It's a different risk assessment framework, not an absence of one." As they debated, Mac reached a particularly treacherous section where quicksand pools lay hidden beneath innocent-looking vegetation. Both Prism and WISP had detected the hazard, and were cautiously circumnavigating the entire area, a detour that would add kilometers to their journey. Mac studied the terrain carefully, then gathered several sturdy branches. He tested each pool's location by tossing small objects, mapping the hazard's extent. Then, using the branches as primitive tools, he created a direct path across the dangerous section, saving considerable time and energy. "Remarkable tool use," commented Counselor Eld of the scientific branch. "He's treating the environment as malleable rather than fixed." "Precisely the concern," Counselor Zinn countered. "Deathworlders reshape environments instead of adapting to them. Their inclusion in certain Federation projects poses ecological risks." The monitoring system chimed with an update. Prism, Lumerian. Hazards identified. 4850 path efficiency. 76% energy conservation. 92% completion. Estimate, 2.8 hours, WISP, Nebulan. Hazards identified, 4950 path efficiency, 82% energy conservation, 88% completion estimate. 2.3 hours Mac, Human. Hazards identified, 4350 path efficiency, 97%. Energy conservation, 61% completion. Estimate, 0.9 hours. The human will complete the course in less than 1 hour, despite identifying fewer hazards, Vex observed. "Our assessment methodology," clearly fails to capture the full spectrum of survival strategies. Or perhaps it correctly identifies concerning behavioral patterns, Counselor Zinn suggested. The human's approach depletes resources rapidly and accepts physical damage. On longer timescales, such strategies prove unsustainable. Unless, Counselor Eld mused, the species has evolved rapid recovery mechanisms and resource acquisition, efficiencies specifically to support this high-risk, high-reward approach. As they watched, Mac encountered one of the simulation's most dangerous elements, a predator specifically designed to be virtually undetectable by standard sensory mechanisms. Both Prism and Wisp had failed to identify this particular threat. Yet somehow, Mac sensed its presence. He froze momentarily, then slowly changed direction. When the creature stalked closer, Mac didn't flee. Instead, he deliberately positioned himself near a toxic plant cluster that he had previously identified. When the predator pounced, Mac dodged at the last moment. The creature crashed into the poisonous vegetation, becoming momentarily disoriented, just long enough for Mac to escape. He used one threat against another, Counselor Eld observed with scientific appreciation. Fascinating adaptive problem-solving. Or dangerous unpredictability, Counselor Zinn countered. The debate continued as Mac approached the final stretch of the assessment course, demonstrating a survival approach that challenged fundamental Federation assumptions about optimal species behavior. The extraction point came into view, a shimmering portal at the crest of a steep incline. Between the candidates and their goal lay the simulation's most challenging hazard, a geologically unstable ravine filled with toxic gas and patrolled by the most advanced predator species in the program. In the observation room, the council members had been joined by additional specialists, all attempting to contextualize the human's performance within Federation classification frameworks. Final approach telemetry is active, Trill announced. All candidates have visual confirmation of the extraction point. On the monitors, they watched as each candidate assessed the challenge before them. Prism conducted a thorough analysis, their crystalline structure vibrating to map the safest path. The Lumerian identified a narrow route that minimized exposure to both the toxic atmosphere and the predator's patrol patterns. Wisp expanded their form to create a diffuse cloud, becoming nearly invisible to the predator's sensory systems while simultaneously filtering the toxic elements from the air they needed to pass through. Mac stood motionless for several minutes, simply observing. His biosigns indicated intense concentration, his eyes tracking the movement patterns of the predators while his hands tested wind direction. What is the human's strategy? Counselor Zinn demanded. The direct approach would be suicide. I believe he's plotting an indirect solution, Vex replied. Indeed. Mac retreated from his position, returning to an area they had previously observed. He gathered specific resources, a cluster of reactive spores, several pieces of flammable vegetation, and a container of water in which he had cultivated a culture of bioluminescent microorganisms. He's creating a diversion, Krell realized. Mac returned to the ravine's edge and assembled his collected materials into several packages. He positioned them strategically around the perimeter, then used his fire-making tools to ignite a carefully timed sequence. The resulting chemical reactions created spectacular light displays, disruptive sounds, and peculiar odors, all calibrated to the sensory vulnerabilities of the predator species. The creatures immediately abandoned their patrol patterns, drawn to investigate these unexpected phenomena. Meanwhile, the human quickly navigated through the temporarily unguarded sector, using natural terrain features to minimize his exposure to the toxic atmosphere. The monitoring station recorded the final statistics: Prism, Lumerian. Hazards correctly identified. 50-50 hazards, successfully avoided. 50-50 completion time, 19.4 hours. Wisp, Nebulon. Hazards correctly identified, 49-50. Hazards successfully avoided, 49-50 completion time, 18.7 hours. Mac, Human. Hazards correctly identified, 46-50. Hazards successfully avoided, 27-50. Hazards successfully utilized, 23-50. Completion time, 15.2 hours. The human completed the course over 3 hours faster than the others, despite identifying fewer hazards, Counselor Eld observed. And this hazard utilization metric, we've never needed to measure such behavior before. The simulation concluded as all three candidates reached the extraction point. The environment dissolved around them, returning to the blank chamber. Medical teams immediately conducted post-assessment evaluations. PRISM and WISP showed minimal stress markers and no physical damage. Textbook perfect performances according to standard metrics. MAC, however, displayed numerous minor injuries. Mild chemical burns, moderate dehydration, elevated stress hormones, and significant energy depletion. Yet his cognitive function remained optimal, and most surprisingly, his psychological evaluation showed elevated mood indicators. The human experienced physical damage, yet reports the assessment as exhilarating, Trill noted with confusion. He registers the experience as positive despite clear biological harm. This explains much about their species' advancement, Counselor Eld mused. Their neural reward systems must be fundamentally calibrated to prioritize novelty and challenge over safety and comfort. In the debriefing chamber, Commander Vex addressed the candidates. Congratulations on completing the assessment. Your performances have been documented and will inform your species' status within the Federation. PRISM chimed with harmonic satisfaction. WISP pulsed acknowledgement. Mac simply nodded, already appearing restless for the next challenge. I must acknowledge, Vex continued, that this assessment has revealed limitations in our evaluation methodology, particularly concerning Deathworld species and their unique approach to environmental threats. Did I do something wrong? Mac asked. Not wrong, Vex clarified. Simply unexpected. Our assessment was designed to measure danger recognition and avoidance. Your species appears to have evolved a fundamentally different relationship with danger, one that involves engagement rather than evasion. Well, yeah, Mac replied with a shrug. There's not much on Earth you can completely avoid. You either figure out how to work with it or around it. Later, as the Council formulated their official report, a new classification category was proposed: adaptive threat engagement. Species demonstrating this trait would require specialized protocols within the Federation, not restrictions based on presumed deficiency, but guidelines acknowledging their unique capabilities. Deathworlders aren't danger blind, Vex explained in his final presentation. They simply define danger differently. What most species recognize as a threat to be avoided, they perceive as a challenge to be overcome, a perspective that makes them simultaneously the most vulnerable and most adaptable species we've encountered. The Council chambers fell silent as the implications settled. The Federation had always operated on the assumption that rational sentience evolved toward risk minimization. The humans had demonstrated an alternative evolutionary path, one where calculated risk-taking drove innovation and adaptation. They weren't oblivious to danger. They were intimately familiar with it. So familiar they had learned to use it rather than fear it. And that made them either the Federation's greatest asset or its greatest concern.